The morning sun spilled golden light over the fields of Iowa, catching the tops of endless corn rows that stretched toward the horizon like an ocean of green. Flight 382 cruised at 30,000 feet above that sea of farmland, a gleaming metal tube carrying over 200 lives toward Chicago. From the outside, everything seemed ordinary, almost serene, but inside the cabin there was a subtle undercurrent of energy. The hum of conversations, the clink of coffee cups, the mechanical murmur of the engines. Among the passengers sat Tom Hensley, known in his small town of Cedar Grove as Farmer Tom. He was a man of few words, broad-shouldered, calloused hands that had spent decades working the earth, a life measured in seasons rather than minutes. Today, however, he was a passenger like anyone else, seated in 14C, gazing out the window with a quiet intensity. His straw hat rested on the seat beside him, a relic of a rural life that seemed worlds away from the sleek modernity of the jet. Around him, passengers fidgeted in their seats. A businessman in a crisp suit tapped nervously at his laptop. A young couple whispered promises of vacation and love. A child pressed her forehead against the glass, mesmerized by the clouds drifting beneath the plane like islands in a white sea. The world seemed perfectly normal, ordinary even, and for a few fleeting moments, everyone felt untouchable, suspended in the cocoon of altitude and routine. Then came the voice, calm, professional, yet weighted with a gravity that instantly cut through the morning chatter. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're experiencing unexpected engine difficulties. Prepare for an emergency landing." The words struck like lightning. Conversations died mid-sentence. Coffee cups rattled against trays. A silence heavier than any cloud filled the cabin, a silence that tasted of fear and disbelief. People glanced at each other, eyes wide, scanning faces for reassurance that never came. A mother clutched her child with trembling hands, whispering, "It's going to be okay, it's going to be okay." But her voice faltered under the weight of its own uncertainty. The child's small hands gripped her mother's arm as if holding on could somehow anchor them to safety. Tom remained still, his gaze unwavering, fixed on the distant horizon beyond the window. The hum of the engines had changed, subtly but undeniably, a low growl that felt like the warning of an animal sensing danger. He could feel the plane's slight shuddering beneath him, a vibration that hinted at the fragility of the metal shell around them. Then the captain's voice again, more urgent this time, cutting into the tense quiet. "Ladies and gentlemen, brace for impact. We're losing altitude. Prepare for a crash landing." Screams erupted, spontaneous and chaotic. People lunged for seatbelts, hands trembling as they fumbled with the buckles. Phones clattered to the floor. The overhead bins rattled ominously, sending loose items tumbling like shrapnel. Somewhere, a man yelled, "No, no, no," and it echoed down the aisle, blending with the panicked cries of mothers, fathers, and children. Amid the rising chaos, Tom remained unnervingly calm. His hands rested lightly on the armrests, fingers twitching not with fear, but with a readiness born from a lifetime of facing storms far more intimate and terrifying than this. Storms in his life had come in the form of tornadoes that ripped through fields at dawn, of livestock lost to disease, of winters that claimed crops and hope alike. He understood danger. He understood panic. And he understood one unshakable truth: fear was only useful if it spurred action. He turned slightly to the passenger in the aisle seat, a middle-aged man whose face had gone pale as milk. Tom's blue eyes met his, steady, unflinching. "Hand me the controls," he said, quietly, almost casually, as if offering to pass the salt. The man blinked, disbelief etched in every line of his face. What did you just say?" "Hand me the controls," Tom repeated. There was no hesitation, no tremor, only certainty. The surrounding passengers turned at the voice. Murmurs rippled through the cabin. Some laughed nervously, assuming he was joking. Others froze, unsure if they had heard correctly. A young woman, her hands pressed to her mouth, whispered, "Is he serious?" The captain's voice crackled over the intercom again, tense, shaky. "Co-pilot, secure the cabin. We were losing control." But Tom didn't wait for permission. He stood, the aisle constricting around him as he moved with a farmer's balance, steady, deliberate, used to navigating tight spaces with loads of grain or hay stacked high. Flight attendants, faces pale, gripped their seats, unsure whether to stop him or let him pass. The plane jolted violently, throwing the first wave of panic into an almost physical tremor. Overhead lights flickered. Oxygen masks hung uselessly in the air, dangling like ghostly reminders of mortality. Tom approached the cockpit, his boots clicking with a rhythm that seemed to command attention amid the chaos. The door was closed, and a co-pilot's frantic hands were already on the controls, fingers flying over buttons and switches in a blur of desperation. The captain was shouting orders, voice strained, nearly breaking. Tom's hand rested on the door, and for a heartbeat, the world seemed to pause. Outside the windows, the clouds swirled in distorted shapes, light refracted violently through the shifting mist. Inside, every person on the plane was suspended in a liminal space between life and death, their fates dangling by a thread they could neither see nor touch. Then with quiet authority, Tom said, "Step aside." The captain froze, disbelief etched across his face. You can't just." Tom's eyes held him, steady and unyielding. "Trust me, I know what I'm doing." And in that instant, a collective, unspoken tension gripped the cabin. Passengers didn't yet know whether salvation or catastrophe would follow. All they knew was the extraordinary calm of one man amidst the storm, a calm that promised both hope and uncertainty. As the plane jolted again, dropping hundreds of feet in moments, the weight of reality pressed in. Panic rose like a tide, yet the strange, quiet determination in 14C, Tom's seat, was a beacon cutting through the chaos. The storm outside was real, the danger was real, and the man in 14C, ordinary yet impossibly resolute, was about to step into the impossible. The plane tilted sharply, the engine screaming in protest, metal groaning as if crying out under the strain. Children screamed. Adults shouted. Somewhere a woman fainted. The cacophony of fear was overwhelming. And yet through it all, Tom stood, ready to meet the storm on his own terms, a lifetime of instinct converging into a single moment of action. "Hand me the controls," he said again, louder this time, voice steady against the rising panic. And as the cockpit door began to open, as the hum of the engines reached a terrifying crescendo, every eye in the cabin turned toward him. The farmer, the ordinary man, the one who would either save them all or become the center of the worst disaster anyone had ever witnessed. The plane lurched once more, and for the first time every soul on board realized the story they were about to live would be nothing short of extraordinary. The cabin was a storm of terror. Passengers clung to their seats as the plane pitched violently, metal shrieking under the strain. Overhead bins rattled violently, spilling handbags, jackets, and a lone water bottle that bounced across the aisle. The fluorescent lights flickered, casting distorted shadows over faces frozen in fear. Every heartbeat seemed to echo, every breath a desperate plea for safety. Tom Hensley, the unlikeliest of heroes, moved with the precision and calm of a man who had wrestled storms on land far deadlier than this. His boots hit the aisle like deliberate drumbeats, each step cutting through the panic. Mothers pressed their children close, tears streaking their faces. Men gripped armrests until their knuckles went white. A teenage girl whispered prayers she didn't even believe. The cacophony of human fear was overwhelming, yet somehow Tom felt clarity. He reached the cockpit door, now slightly ajar. Inside, chaos reigned. The captain's hands trembled over the yoke, sweat dripping down his face, hair plastered from exertion. The co-pilot shouted instructions, frantically flipping switches, trying to regain control. Red warning lights flashed incessantly, each one screaming a different form of doom. The engine's roar was deafening, each note a warning of impending disaster. Tom didn't hesitate. His hand rested on the frame of the cockpit door. His voice, calm yet commanding, cut through the din. "Step aside." The captain spun toward him, disbelief etched into every line of his face. "You can't just," he started, but Tom's steady gaze silenced him. "I know what I'm doing," Tom said. It wasn't arrogance, it was resolve. A lifetime of handling emergencies, reading the land, reading the sky, reading situations where split-second decisions meant life or death. It all converged in that single sentence. Reluctantly, the captain stepped back, giving Tom room. The co-pilot hesitated, but the panic of the situation forced him to yield. Tom stepped into the cockpit. The instruments were a terrifying mosaic of blinking lights and spinning dials. Alarms screamed like sirens, demanding attention. Tom's eyes moved over them, absorbing the chaos, filtering what was critical from what wasn't. "Okay," he muttered under his breath, almost to himself, "focus." He reached for the controls. His hands, rough and scarred from years of work with farm machinery, gripped the yoke with surprising ease. He had never flown a commercial airliner before, but he had flown gliders in his youth, had handled tractors and harvesters in conditions that defied logic, had wrestled storms and snowdrifts and flooded fields. This, he decided, was no different, just bigger, faster, higher stakes. The plane lurched violently. Oxygen masks fell from the ceiling, dangling uselessly in the middle of the cabin. A woman screamed, clutching a child, her face pale as bone. The man beside her swore under his breath, gripping the armrest like it was a lifeline. Passengers yelled, some crying, some paralyzed by fear, some screaming into the void. Tom focused. Flaps, altitude, engine thrust. Steady, steady, steady. Every decision had to be precise. Every movement counted. One misstep could send the plane spiraling into the earth below. The co-pilot, pale and trembling, asked, "You've flown a plane before?" Tom shook his head. "Not like this, but I know how to stay alive." The words were simple, but in that cockpit, amidst alarms and flashing lights, they carried a weight heavier than steel. Outside, the world was a blur of clouds and sunlight, distorted by turbulence. The plane dipped, a stomach-churning drop that made everyone gasp, hearts lodged in throats. A mother screamed, "We're going to die." Her voice was raw, primal, echoing the fear that everyone felt. Tom shot her a look, calm, unshakable, like a lighthouse in a storm. "Not yet," his eyes seemed to say. The plane's nose pitched downward sharply. Instruments flashed red in warning. The engines roared, a violent scream of metal in revolt. Tom's mind raced. He couldn't think like a pilot. He had no training in this aircraft. But he could think like a problem solver, a man who understood the physics of motion, the behavior of machines, the instincts of survival. "Flaps," he muttered, "throttle steady." The co-pilot tried to follow, wide-eyed, unsure, but Tom's presence was commanding, a strange authority born not of rank but of resolve. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, the plane began to respond. The shuddering decreased, though only slightly. It was a small victory, but in the middle of chaos, small victories were all that mattered. Back in the cabin, passengers were beginning to notice something unusual. The screaming continued, yes, but it was punctuated by whispers of disbelief. "Is he really doing this?" a young man muttered under his breath. "Who is he?" A grandmother, wringing her hands, looked around at the fear-stricken faces. "If anyone can survive this, it's him," she whispered to herself, unsure if she truly believed it or was desperately clinging to hope. The plane lurched again. This time the shift was more violent. A jolt threw Tom against the side of the cockpit. His body slammed back upright, but his grip on the controls never wavered. The co-pilot staggered, muttering curses and prayers in equal measure. Tom's knuckles were white, sweat dripping into his eyes, but his focus remained unbroken. Through the cabin windows, the clouds swirled with unnatural speed. Sunlight fractured into shards, dancing across terrified faces. The world outside was a spinning chaos, threatening to devour them all. "Brace for turbulence," Tom said to no one in particular, his voice calm, almost eerily so. He adjusted the throttle with precision, feeling the vibrations through his arms, through the controls, through the very core of his being. He was in rhythm with the machine, not as a pilot, but as someone who understood mechanics, forces, and instinctive action. The plane dipped again, throwing passengers forward. Children screamed. An elderly man clutched the seat in front of him, trembling. But in the cockpit, a strange, almost miraculous sense of control had begun to emerge. Tom had no training, yet every decision he made nudged the plane closer to stability. Suddenly, the captain, previously pale and panicked, muttered, He might actually know what he's doing." His voice was a mixture of awe and terror. The plane's descent slowed, albeit just slightly. The shrieking alarms began to fade into the background, replaced by the groaning of stressed metal. Tom didn't celebrate. There was no time. Not yet. Survival demanded focus, not relief. Outside, the farmland below stretched endlessly. Rivers sparkled in the sunlight. Roads cut straight lines through the patchwork of fields. Somewhere, he thought, there might be a place to land. Somewhere safe. But the question gnawed at him. How would he guide this beast of metal to Earth without killing everyone inside? The plane dipped again, a violent jolt throwing passengers into seats and walls alike. A scream rose above the chaos, piercing, raw. Tom's stomach twisted, not with fear but with the weight of responsibility. Every life in this cabin rested on him, and failure was not an option. He adjusted the controls once more, subtle movements honed by instinct and determination. He was no pilot. He was a farmer, a man of grit and intuition, and somehow that was enough. The plane trembled. Passengers clutched each other. Oxygen masks swayed, dangling like ghosts. Tom's eyes narrowed, scanning instruments and horizon, searching for hope in a sea of chaos. Then a sliver of sunlight broke through the clouds, glinting off a distant patch of open land. Tom's heart skipped. Could it be? Could that barren stretch of earth, miles below, be their lifeline? The plane lurched violently again, and every passenger screamed in terror. But for the first time, a flicker of possibility entered the cabin. Could an ordinary farmer save them from impossible odds? As Flight 382 hurtled through the sky, a fragile hope threaded through the fear. The improbable might just become reality. The cockpit was a furnace of alarms, red lights, and panicked voices. Tom Hensley's knuckles ached from gripping the controls, his arms trembling, yet his eyes were sharper than ever. Outside, clouds churned like boiling soup. Sunlight refracted into sharp streaks that sliced across the fuselage. The plane pitched violently, threatening to spin into an uncontrollable dive. Altitude dropping, too fast, the co-pilot shouted, sweat streaming down his face. His hands shook as he attempted to regain some semblance of control. Tom didn't speak at first. He scanned the instruments with a calm born of instinct. He wasn't a trained pilot. He had no formal education in aviation. But he had survived storms, floods, and winters that should have killed him, and he had learned to read machines, land, and people with equal precision. He placed his hand on the throttle and muttered to himself, "Steady, steady, feel the machine." The captain, pale and trembling, hesitated, eyes darting between Tom and the spinning instruments. I don't know if this." "Step aside, please," Tom said, his voice low but commanding. There was no time for argument. Every second counted. The plane was dropping too fast, altitude bleeding like a wound. The co-pilot reluctantly moved to the side. The captain hesitated, one hand still on the emergency controls, but finally stepped back, muttering prayers under his breath. Tom's gaze locked onto the horizon, then down at the land below. The endless patchwork of green and brown fields stretched like a quilt toward the distance. Somewhere out there, he needed a landing strip, or something close enough. Anything that could stop them from plummeting into death. He adjusted the yoke slightly, feeling the vibrations through his arms, through his chest, through every nerve. The plane shuddered violently, throwing him against the side wall, yet he held on, refusing to let panic touch him. Think, focus, act. In the cabin, passengers screamed. Mothers clutched children, men gritted their teeth, and some had gone silent, frozen in disbelief. The young couple in row 15 held hands so tightly their knuckles turned white. A grandmother murmured the Lord's Prayer over and over, tears streaking her cheeks. And all the while, Tom's mind raced, mapping possibilities with the precision of a man who had lived his life calculating risk and reward. He had no instruments, no training beyond a handful of glider flights decades ago, yet every instinct told him that survival was possible if he acted decisively. Hesitation would kill them. The plane pitched again, throwing the co-pilot against the wall. A child's scream cut through the cabin. Tom's stomach clenched, not with fear but with responsibility. Every person aboard depended on him. Every life rested in the hands of a man who had once only worried about corn yields and livestock. Altitude, flaps, throttle, brakes, he whispered under his breath, his voice steady, guiding the machine with a rhythm that seemed almost supernatural. It was as if years of plowing fields, reading storms, and navigating mud-soaked roads had trained him for this moment. The co-pilot watched, wide-eyed disbelief and awe mingling on his face. He might actually do this, he muttered. Tom scanned the instruments again, noticing a faint glimmer in the distance, a break in the clouds, sunlight illuminating a stretch of open farmland. His pulse quickened. Could that be their lifeline? Could they land there? It was far from ideal, uneven, rocky, and probably too short, but it was the only chance they had. "Captain," Tom said, finally breaking his silence, voice calm but urgent, "we have a strip below. We land there or we die. I need full control." The captain hesitated, fear etched into every line of his face. You've never flown." "I know," Tom interrupted, "but I've landed tractors in snowstorms, driven harvesters through mud floods, and survived tornadoes you wouldn't believe. Trust me." A tense moment stretched across the cockpit. The plane shuddered violently, alarms screaming in chorus. Passengers screamed again, their cries slicing through the cabin like knives. And then the captain, driven by desperation and trust in this man's strange calm, finally nodded. "Do it. Take control." Tom exhaled, centering himself. The plane lurched, tilted dangerously, and a wave of vertigo hit him. He gripped the yoke tighter, muscles coiled, focusing entirely on the physics, the rhythm, the instinct. He visualized the landing, step by step, like plotting a course through a storm he had navigated 1,000 times before. Only this storm was alive, metallic, screaming in protest. "Throttle, ease it back," he murmured, adjusting the controls with care. The engines roared in response, but the plane obeyed slightly, its massive body shuddering under his hands. "Flaps, deploy slowly, steady." In the cabin, panic was raw and unfiltered. Children cried, adults screamed, but through the din, a strange hush began to form, a whisper of disbelief. Was this ordinary man actually tamming the uncontrollable? Was hope threading its way into this nightmare? The plane dipped sharply and Tom's stomach lurched. He gritted his teeth, forcing his mind back to the task. Focus. Step by step. Don't let fear in. He adjusted the yoke, nudged the controls with precision, and began a slow, agonizing descent. "Watch the altitude, watch the speed," he muttered to himself, the cockpit alive with tension. Every instrument demanded attention, every flicker of a light was a warning. He couldn't rely on training, only instinct, only experience, only courage. Outside, the world spun. The farmland stretched toward them like a dangerous mosaic, dotted with barns, silos, and winding roads. The landing strip, small and uneven, gleamed faintly in the sunlight. One miscalculation, one false move, and the plane would meet the earth with fatal consequences. The co-pilot looked at him, voice trembling. How are you doing this?" Tom's jaw tightened. "I told you, focus. Instinct, keep calm. We survive or we don't. No more thinking, no more doubting." He adjusted the flaps again, the plane groaning under the strain. Each second stretched like an eternity. The engines protested with metallic shrieks, and for a moment it seemed as if the entire machine might disintegrate under pressure. But Tom's grip never faltered. In the cabin, a child stopped crying, sensing something different, though she didn't understand what. The screaming had lessened slightly, replaced by a tense silence threaded with disbelief. Passengers dared to glance toward the cockpit, wondering if salvation could truly be possible. The plane dropped further, dangerously, the ground rushing toward them at terrifying speed. Tom adjusted his angle, calculating instinctively. He could see the rough texture of the field, the uneven soil, the potential hazards that would doom them if misjudged. But it was all they had, and he had no choice. "Steady, steady," he whispered, hands trembling slightly, heart hammering, mind laser-focused. The cockpit became a war zone of lights, alarms, and shuddering metal. The plane responded slightly, infinitesimally to his adjustments. Below, the patch of land grew larger, more distinct. The realization struck him, they might actually make it. But there was no room for relief, no time for celebration. The plane's descent needed to be perfect, every adjustment precise. One mistake, 1 second of hesitation, and everyone aboard would die. A jolt threw the co-pilot against the wall. "God help us," he muttered. Tom didn't answer. He didn't pray. He didn't hesitate. He acted. Every second was a decision, every movement deliberate. He could feel the rhythm of the plane, the tension of the engines, the pulse of the metal as though it were alive. Then finally, a spark of hope. The plane began to level slightly. Not much, but enough to keep them alive for another moment. He adjusted the yoke again, nudged the throttle, and breathed through the fear. The impossible decision had been made. Tom, a man who had spent his life walking fields and raising crops, had taken control of a screaming metal beast at 30,000 feet. The choice was simple in concept but impossible in execution: survive or die. And in that split second, he chose life. The cabin was no longer just a plane, it had become a vortex of fear, a crucible where every passenger's life hung by a fragile thread. The violent dips and sudden jolts of Flight 382 made stomachs lurch, arms flail, and hearts hammer against ribcage like trapped birds. The fluorescent lights flickered, casting long, grotesque shadows across terrified faces. Every scream, every cry, every whispered prayer was a note in a symphony of panic, and at its center stood Tom Hensley, the improbable pilot, gripping the yoke with hands worn by decades of farming but steady with uncanny focus. The co-pilot leaned against the side of the cockpit, pale as chalk, eyes wide as saucers. Sweat streamed down his face, dripping onto the control panel. I can't believe this," he muttered, voice trembling. You're doing it, but how? How are you flying this thing?" Tom's jaw was set. His piercing blue eyes scanned the instruments, measuring every flicker, every pulse, every vibration. He had no formal pilot training, but he had something more essential: instinct. Years of reading storms, understanding the subtleties of wind, rain, and terrain, translating chaos into action. The plane was no longer just machinery. It was an extension of his will, a massive metal creature responding to every command with grudging obedience. "Throttle adjust. Flaps, incrementally," he muttered, voice low, almost a whisper. His hands moved like a conductor guiding an orchestra, nudging levers, twisting switches, coaxing the aircraft into the most delicate balance it had known in its life. The plane lurched violently again, throwing him back against the side panel. The co-pilot staggered, muttering curses under his breath. Outside, the clouds churned like boiling water, lightning arcing across their path, illuminating the terror etched into every face in the cabin. Passengers screamed, gripped the armrests, clung to children, spouses, anyone within reach. A young mother wept openly, hugging her child so tightly the small boy's face was buried in her shoulder. A teenager muttered over and over, "I don't want to die, I don't want to die," while gripping the seat in front of him. Tom's mind, however, was unbroken. Every heartbeat was a metronome, every breath a measure in the symphony of survival. He visualized the earth below, the fields, rivers, silos, and roads, calculating distance, wind, speed, and angle. One miscalculation could send them into a fatal spiral, yet hesitation was not an option. A violent gust of wind slammed into the fuselage, tilting the plane sharply. The overhead bins rattled, spilling belongings onto terrified passengers. A man screamed as a laptop slid across the floor, narrowly missing the legs of a screaming child. Tom's hands twitched, adjusting the controls, coaxing the plane to level, feeling every tremor, every vibration through his arms. "Keep calm, keep control," he whispered, repeating the mantra to himself as if it were a spell that could command the chaos into submission. The co-pilot's hands were trembling uncontrollably, and he muttered, "I've never seen anything like this, a farmer flying a plane." Tom didn't answer. There was no time for words. There was only action. The plane dipped again sharply, and he felt his stomach twist. In that instant, he was back on the farm, sliding a tractor through frozen mud, balancing tons of corn on a trailer, navigating storms that threatened to tear everything apart. The experience wasn't the same, but the instinct was. The ability to read a living, moving machine, anticipate its behavior, and guide it to safety. He glanced at the instruments. Altitude bleeding, speed rising dangerously, turbulence intensifying. The open patch of farmland below had grown larger in his vision, a narrow beacon of hope in a swirling storm of metal, wind, and fear. "Steady, steady," he muttered again, hands trembling slightly, lips pressed tight. The plane shuddered violently as a gust of wind hit the wing. Sparks flashed from the engine, small but ominous. The co-pilot gasped. "We're not going to." "Shut up," Tom snapped, voice harsh but controlled. "Focus on me. Focus on the controls. Don't panic." The cockpit shook, the alarm screamed, but somehow his command brought a sliver of order to the chaos. The plane responded ever so slightly, tilting less violently, groaning under strain but obeying enough to give them a fighting chance. Back in the cabin, passengers were noticing something extraordinary. The screaming was punctuated by glances toward the cockpit. Murmurs of disbelief rippled through the cabin. "Is he controlling it?" A man whispered, voice trembling. A grandmother whispered a prayer of thanks. A young girl, eyes wide, clutched her stuffed animal and dared to hope. But Tom didn't allow hope to distract him. Hope could be a trap, fear a guide. Every nerve in his body was focused on one thing, guiding this metal beast safely to the ground. He adjusted flaps again, nudged the yoke, and whispered instructions to himself like a mantra, a prayer, a code. The plane shuddered again. Another violent gust threatened to roll them onto their side. Tom's hands were white-knuckled. He could feel the strain through his arms, chest, and core. Sweat poured down his face, stinging his eyes, but he ignored it. "Think, adjust, compensate, don't panic." He glanced briefly at the co-pilot, who had gone pale, muttering incomprehensibly. "Watch the wing, watch the angle steady," Tom commanded softly. His mind was working faster than he had ever imagined possible, calculating wind vectors, speed, altitude, distance, and the fragile, uneven patch of land below that could be their salvation, or their doom. The plane pitched sharply downward again, and this time the tail dipped, threatening a complete spin. Tom's stomach lurched. He closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, imagining the plane as an extension of himself. Years of plowing fields, raising livestock, navigating flooded roads, they all converged in that instant. He reached into the storm, gripping the plane with his hands, mind, and will. Hold it," he whispered. The metal groaned under strain, but the plane responded just slightly, a delicate dance of survival. A flash of lightning illuminated the cabin, revealing terrified, tear-streaked faces. A child whimpered, looking at Tom as if he were a guardian angel. Mothers clutched children, spouses clutched each other, and the plane continued its tortured descent. Outside, the ground rushed closer, the farmland stretching like an impossible mosaic of hope and death. Tom's eyes locked on the patch of open field, assessing distance, slope, hazards. There was a barn on one side, a row of trees on the other, and a winding creek just beyond. It was no airport, no runway, but it was the only chance they had. "Flaps adjust, slowly," he whispered, nudging the yoke, coaxing the plane into a gentle, terrifying glide. The engine roared, but the aircraft moved as he intended, inch by agonizing inch. The co-pilot, trembling, whispered, I don't understand how." Tom didn't answer. He had no time. He couldn't allow disbelief, fear, or hope to distract him. He had to remain the calm center in a storm of chaos. Then something extraordinary happened. The plane began to level slightly, tilting less violently. The shuddering decreased, not much, but enough to give a fragile sense of control. Every passenger's heart skipped a beat. Every scream was still there, every tear still flowed, but hope, tiny, trembling, defiant, began to thread through the terror. Tom's voice was low, controlled, almost invisible over the screams in the cabin. "Keep it steady, just a little longer." He was more than a farmer now. He was a lifeline, a man standing between death and survival for over 200 souls. Every second mattered. Every adjustment could mean the difference between life and catastrophe. The plane was still descending rapidly, the field below still dangerously close, the barn and creek threatening to end everything. But for the first time, survival seemed possible. And in that moment, as the storm raged outside and panic filled every inch of the cabin, Tom Hensley understood something fundamental. Sometimes, courage alone, tempered with instinct, honed by experience and guided by the heart, was enough to wrest the impossible from the jaws of death. The plane shuddered violently again, and the cockpit was alive with alarms and flashing lights. The earth below was impossibly close, and yet Tom held it, steady, determined, focused. The descent had begun, but the true test, the impossible landing, was only just beginning. The patch of farmland grew larger in the windshield of the cockpit, a tiny beacon of hope amid the swirling chaos. Trees jutted up like jagged teeth, a barn leaned precariously to one side, and a narrow creek twisted across the land like a silver snake. It was no runway, no clear path, no margin for error, but it was all they had, and Tom Hensley, the unlikely hero in 14C, knew it or nothing. The plane shuddered violently as another gust slammed against the fuselage. Alarms blared, warning lights flashed, and the engines groaned, threatening to give way under the strain. Tom's hands were white-knuckled, arms trembling, sweat stinging his eyes. Every instinct, every ounce of experience, every lesson learned from years of wrestling storms on the farm, guided his actions now. He was a conductor of chaos, coaxing a screaming metal giant to obey him, even as death lurked inches away. "Altitude steady, steady," he muttered, voice low and controlled. The co-pilot hovered behind him, pale as bone, muttering incomprehensibly, too stunned to act. The captain, leaning against the panel, eyes wide, whispered a prayer that barely reached above the roar of the engines. The cabin below was a cacophony of terror. Screams cut through the air, punctuated by sobs, whispered prayers, and the occasional curse. Children clung to parents with desperation, faces pressed against shoulders. Adults gripped seatbacks in each other, knuckles white, hearts hammering. Some were crying outright, others were paralyzed in disbelief. Every human emotion was on display, raw and unfiltered, as they hurtled toward a fate that seemed unavoidable. Tom didn't look at them. He didn't allow himself that distraction. His eyes were locked on the field below, measuring angles, speed, and distance with a precision born of instinct. He could feel the plane's vibrations through his arms, through his chest, through every nerve. It responded to him, slowly, agonizingly, inch by inch. The plane dipped again, violently, pitching dangerously to the left. Tom adjusted the yoke, nudging the controls with careful precision. Sparks flashed from one of the engines, small but alarming, a reminder of how close they were to disaster. "Flaps deploy fully, no sudden movements," he muttered. The co-pilot nodded, hands trembling as he followed his instructions, though it was unclear whether he truly understood them. A scream erupted from the cabin. Tom didn't flinch. He had learned long ago that panic could be contagious, that fear could cripple faster than any storm. He focused on the immediate task, bringing the plane down, intact, alive. The ground rushed toward them with terrifying speed. The field, uneven and fraught with hazards, loomed larger. Barns, silos, and the twisting creek posed deadly obstacles. One wrong movement and the plane would crash in seconds. "Brace for impact," someone shouted from the cabin. Their voice carried over the screaming and the alarm bells. Mothers clutched children tighter. Fathers gritted teeth, holding onto seats as if sheer will could protect them. The plane lurched again, and the world outside blurred in violent motion. Tom's heart pounded, but his mind was calm, methodical. He had survived tornadoes, floods, winters that should have killed him. He had wrestled machines into submission, coaxed life from chaos. And now he applied the same principles here: observation, calculation, instinct, courage. The plane's nose dipped dangerously. Altitude ticked down alarmingly fast. He adjusted throttle, nudged the yoke, and spoke to himself quietly, a mantra against the storm. Steady, steady, steady. Below, the narrow field stretched like a thread between life and death. A barn leaned on one side, a row of trees threatened another, and the creek glimmered like a trap across the landing path. It was a minefield of hazards, yet it was their only chance. Tom's eyes measured distance, slope, and speed simultaneously, a mental calculation so complex it would have daunted even seasoned pilots. The plane pitched violently to the right. Tom countered, adjusting the yoke with delicate precision. Sparks from the engines flared again. The co-pilot gasped audibly, eyes wide in terror. The captain's face was pale, every muscle tense, lips moving silently in a desperate prayer. "Flaps full, slowly, throttle gentle," Tom muttered, nudging the controls with care. The plane responded, shuddering but obedient. Inch by agonizing inch, they drew closer to the earth. In the cabin, terror gave way to tense anticipation. Passengers whispered, unsure if hope was real or illusion. Some clung to loved ones, some stared at the ceiling, some closed their eyes, preparing for death. The screaming had not stopped, but it was punctuated by tiny gasps of disbelief. Could they survive? Could this ordinary man, this farmer, really tame the impossible? The plane lurched violently again. Tom's stomach lurched with it. The ground raced toward them. Barns, trees, and the creek loomed, threatening catastrophe. Sweat poured down his face, stinging his eyes, but he refused to look away. One misstep could mean instant death for everyone aboard. He adjusted throttle again, nudged the yoke, and whispered under his breath, "Steady, steady, steady, slow." The plane responded, shuddering, groaning, but alive. Outside, the field drew closer, every detail visible. A lone barn on the left, a grove of trees on the right, the creek cutting across the far edge. The margin for error was microscopic. One wrong angle, one misjudgment, one misstep, and they would be crushed. The co-pilot, still pale and shaking, muttered, I can't believe this, he's keeping it level." Tom didn't answer. He couldn't. He had no room for doubt, no time for fear, no allowance for error. Every ounce of his being was concentrated on guiding the plane, inching it toward the fragile strip of safety. The plane pitched again, violently, and Tom countered. Sparks flared from the engines, metal groaned under the strain, but the aircraft obeyed just enough. The field below grew larger. The end was in sight, and yet more dangerous than the sky above. "Brace, brace, brace," someone shouted from the cabin. Mothers clutched children. Fathers held onto seatbacks. Screams erupted again, but threaded through the fear was a fragile, impossible hope that they might survive. Tom adjusted flaps again, nudged the yoke, whispered instructions to himself. The plane trembled, shuddered, groaned, and yet in this impossible descent, inch by agonizing inch, survival seemed plausible. The field drew nearer. The creek glittered ominously. The barn loomed. The plane's nose dipped dangerously, speed rising. Every muscle in Tom's body strained with tension. Every decision was life or death. The co-pilot gasped, whispering, he's going to make it." The plane pitched again, sparks flared, sweat streamed down faces, hearts hammered, and yet in the heart of chaos, a strange, impossible calm reigned in 14C. Tom Hensley, farmer, hero, miracle worker, guided Flight 382 toward a landing that seemed impossible, yet perhaps, just perhaps, survivable. The ground was almost upon them. The moment of truth had arrived. The impossible landing was about to begin. The patch of farmland stretched below like a lifeline or a trap. To anyone looking from above, it seemed impossibly small, surrounded by barns, trees, and a winding creek. To Tom Hensley, it was a narrow corridor between life and death, a challenge he had never faced, yet instinct told him it was possible. The plane pitched violently again and the cabin lurched. Mothers screamed, clutching children. Fathers gritted teeth, gripping seats as if sheer force of will could save them. A teenage boy whimpered, eyes squeezed shut, praying for a miracle he didn't think would come. Tom's hands were white-knuckled on the yoke, arms trembling. Sweat poured down his face, stinging his eyes. Every alarm in the cockpit screamed, a chorus of metallic panic, but he didn't falter. He had faced storms, floods, and frozen fields. He had wrestled with machines and weathered chaos. Now he wrestled with this, a roaring beast of metal hurtling toward a fragile patch of earth. "Throttle steady, flaps adjust," he muttered under his breath. His voice was calm, almost eerily so, slicing through the chaos like a knife. The co-pilot hovered behind him, pale and trembling, muttering prayers and disbelief. The plane dipped sharply. Sparks flashed from the engines, small warnings of imminent disaster. Tom adjusted the yoke slightly, nudging the throttle, coaxing the plane to obey. Inch by agonizing inch, they descended toward the field, the ground rushing up faster than seemed possible. In the cabin, passengers clung to one another. Screams mixed with prayers, whispered pleas and sobs. A young girl clutched a stuffed animal, staring wide-eyed at the ceiling, trying to make sense of the impossible. A grandmother whispered prayers over and over, clutching her rosary like a talisman. And through it all, hope, fragile, flickering, defiant, threaded its way into the fear. "Steady, steady, steady," Tom whispered again, eyes scanning the field below. The uneven terrain, the barn on one side, the creek on the other, it was a minefield. But he visualized the landing, every step, every adjustment, every small correction. He could feel the plane responding, groaning under the strain, every vibration a signal, every shudder a warning. The plane dipped again, dangerously, tilting slightly to the right. Sparks flashed from the left engine. Tom countered immediately, nudging the yoke, adjusting throttle, keeping the plane level enough to approach the field. "Brace for impact," someone shouted from the cabin. Mothers tightened their grips on children, fathers held onto armrests, and a young boy clutched his mother's hand so tightly it left white marks on her palm. Tom didn't flinch. He couldn't. There was no room for fear, no margin for error. The plane's nose dropped, speed increasing. Trees on the edge of the field loomed, threatening to tear the plane apart if misjudged. Sparks flashed again from the engines. He adjusted flaps slowly, deliberately, coaxing the plane into a glide. The field stretched before them, narrow and uneven, lined with hazards. He calculated distance, speed, and slope in seconds, instinct guiding his hands. Every adjustment was precise, every decision life or death. The plane pitched violently once more. Tom countered, coaxing the beast to obedience. The engine screamed, metal groaned, and for a moment it seemed impossible they could survive. Almost there," he whispered, eyes locked on the landing strip. Sweat poured down his face, stinging his eyes, but he ignored it. There was no time for distraction. Below, the field was dangerously close. The barn loomed on one side, trees on the other, and the creek glimmered like a silver trap. The plane's landing gear wasn't meant for rough, uneven terrain. Any misstep could send them into catastrophe. "Steady, steady," Tom repeated, voice barely audible over the roar of engines and alarms. The co-pilot muttered, "He's really doing this, he's really landing it." The plane's descent slowed slightly, inch by inch. The landing gear touched the uneven ground, bouncing violently. Sparks flew as tires scraped over rocks and debris. The fuselage shuddered, threatening to tip. Passengers screamed, some crying, some gripping loved ones. The plane bounced again, veering slightly, but Tom corrected instantly, nudging the yoke with precise, delicate movements. Sweat poured down his face, heart hammering, muscles trembling, but his focus never wavered. The plane skidded over uneven soil, bouncing past rocks and debris. The barn loomed closer, trees reached out threateningly. One wrong adjustment, one slip, and disaster would strike. Tom adjusted throttle, nudged the yoke, whispered instructions to himself. "Steady, steady, steady," the plane groaned, shuddered, but obeyed. Inch by agonizing inch, they moved across the field, alive but fragile. The creek appeared closer, a silver ribbon across the terrain. Tom angled the plane carefully, avoiding it by mere feet. Sparks flew from the undercarriage as it scraped against uneven soil, but the plane held. "Keep it steady," he whispered, sweat stinging his eyes, heart hammering in his chest. Every passenger held their breath, gripping loved ones, clinging to hope threaded through terror. The plane bounced again, narrowly avoiding a barn on one side. Trees loomed on the other. Sparks flew. Metal screamed. But somehow, impossibly, they stayed upright. Tom nudged the yoke slightly, adjusting throttle, coaxing the plane toward the far edge of the field. The ground leveled slightly. The creek lay behind them. The barn was avoided. The plane skidded, bounced, groaned, but it was still alive. In the cabin, disbelief mixed with awe. Screams continued, but threaded through the terror was a fragile, defiant hope. Passengers glanced toward the cockpit, eyes wide. Could they really survive this? Could this ordinary man, this farmer, really save them all? Tom's hands shook, muscles trembling, sweat pouring, but his eyes were fixed on the field, on the fragile lifeline below. One last adjustment, one last correction, one last miracle. The plane skidded across the uneven field, tires scraping rocks, landing gear groaning, metal screaming. Sparks flew, trees loomed. The creek glimmered. But inch by agonizing inch, the plane moved toward safety. Then finally the landing gear touched solid ground. The plane shuddered violently, tires screeching, metal groaning. Sparks flew from the undercarriage. Hearts in the cabin leapt, pounding in rhythm with the groaning engines. Tom kept the yoke steady, coaxing the plane forward, slowing its momentum. The field stretched ahead, uneven, hazardous, but they were on the ground, alive. The plane skidded across the final stretch, bouncing over rocks, narrowly avoiding the last obstacles. Sparks flew, metal screamed, but slowly, impossibly, it began to slow, the momentum easing. Passengers screamed, not in terror but in relief. Some cried, some hugged loved ones, some stared wide-eyed in disbelief. The plane had survived. They had survived. Tom's hands were trembling, sweat pouring down his face. The co-pilot whispered, You did it. We survived." The captain, pale and shaken, could only nod, tears streaming down his face. I don't believe it," he muttered. Outside, the sun broke through the clouds, illuminating the battered but standing plane. The impossible landing had been achieved. Every life on board had survived. Tom Hensley, ordinary farmer turned extraordinary hero, exhaled deeply, feeling the weight of what he had just done. But even as relief washed through the cabin, he knew one thing: the danger wasn't fully over. The plane was damaged, the field was rough, and they were stranded. Survival had been claimed, but the fight was far from finished. Yet in that moment, one thing was undeniable. Against impossible odds they had landed. Against impossible fear, hope had prevailed. Against impossible danger, courage had triumphed. The plane shuddered to a stop. Silence followed, the kind of silence that isn't empty but full of disbelief, relief, and awe. The passengers slowly began to comprehend what had just happened. They had survived an impossible nightmare. And at the center of it all, sitting in the cockpit, battered, bruised, exhausted, but alive, was Tom Hensley, ordinary man, extraordinary courage, unlikely hero. The engines of Flight 382 hissed and groaned as they cooled, metal quivering with the tension of their violent journey. Outside, the sun had broken through the storm clouds, casting a surreal golden light across the battered farmland. The passengers, still wide-eyed and trembling, stared out the windows at the strange calm that followed the chaos. Some sat in stunned silence, others clutched loved ones, and some simply wept, unable to release the fear that had gripped them for what felt like eternity. Emergency crews were already converging on the scene, fire trucks, ambulances, and police vehicles cutting through the muddy fields, lights flashing, sirens wailing. But even amidst the rush of activity, all eyes were drawn to the cockpit, to the man who had achieved the impossible. Tom Hensley finally unbuckled his seatbelt, muscles sore and trembling, sweat soaking his shirt. His hands were still shaking, a combination of exhaustion, adrenaline, and disbelief at what he had just accomplished. He stepped out of the cockpit slowly, feeling every ache in his body, every tremor in his limbs. For a moment, he allowed himself to breathe, to process the impossible. Passengers approached cautiously at first, their faces etched with awe and gratitude. A young mother grasped his hands, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Thank you," she whispered, voice trembling. You saved us, all of us." Tom shook his head, exhausted, almost embarrassed by the attention. I just did what I had to do," he said quietly, voice hoarse. "You all stayed calm. That helped more than anything I could do." A teenage boy, still gripping his mother's hand, looked up at Tom with wide, incredulous eyes. You really landed the plane?" he asked, voice shaking. Tom gave a faint, weary smile. "Yes, we made it, that's what matters." Emergency responders helped the passengers out of the plane, guiding them to safety on the muddy field. Some were shaken but unharmed. Others needed medical attention for minor injuries, scrapes, bruises, shock. Yet no one had died, not a single soul. The media, which had already begun to converge on the field, swarmed the scene with cameras, microphones, and flashbulbs. News crews jostled for position, capturing the miraculous moment as it unfolded. Helicopters circled overhead, their blades whipping the air into a frenzy of wind and noise. Reporters shouted questions, their voices barely audible over the chaos. Tom tried to step aside to avoid the spotlight, but it was impossible. The world wanted to see him, the man who had turned fear into hope, panic into calm, and a doomed flight into a miraculous survival story. "Mr. Hensley, how did you do it?" a reporter shouted, microphone thrust forward. "Were you a trained pilot?" Tom shook his head. "No, I'm just a farmer. I've driven tractors through storms, I've survived floods. I just did what I thought was necessary, that's all." The disbelief in the crowd was palpable. A man with no formal pilot training had landed a commercial jet, carrying hundreds of lives on a narrow, uneven field. Experts would later call it impossible. Defying physics, training, and odds, Tom had turned disaster into survival. As paramedics tended to passengers, Tom allowed himself a moment to reflect. His mind replayed the descent, the violent dips, the engine groans, the terror in the cabin. He remembered the screams, the prayers, the sheer force of panic. He remembered gripping the yoke, feeling every vibration, every shudder, every groan of metal as if the plane itself were alive. And he remembered the surreal calm that had carried him through the storm. He realized then that courage wasn't the absence of fear. Courage was the refusal to let fear control you. It was the ability to act, to choose life, even when every instinct screamed that survival was impossible. And in that moment, he had acted. He had saved over 200 lives. A firefighter approached, clapping him on the shoulder. "You did good, son," he said. "I've seen a lot of rescues, but nothing like this. You're a hero." Tom nodded silently, too tired to speak. The adrenaline that had sustained him was beginning to fade, replaced by a deep, bone-deep exhaustion. Every muscle in his body ached. His hands trembled. Sweat dripped from his hair. And yet he felt a strange satisfaction, an almost spiritual sense that he had done exactly what he was meant to do. Later, as the passengers were escorted to buses and medical tents, Tom sat on the edge of the field, watching the chaos unfold. Families reunited, hugs and tears exchanged. Children clung to parents. Adults held each other, grateful for the impossible gift of life. And all around him, cameras and microphones chronicled the miracle that had just occurred. He thought of his farm back home, the simple life he had led, plowing fields, tending crops, mending fences. He had never imagined that those skills, those instincts, would translate to something like this. Yet somehow, in the crucible of fear and necessity, they had. He had become more than a farmer. He had become a guardian, a lifeline, a hero. But the weight of it all pressed down on him. The media frenzy, the attention, the gratitude, it was overwhelming. He wasn't sure he wanted to be famous. He hadn't saved anyone for recognition. He had saved them because it was the only option, because he could, because it had to be done. A paramedic approached him with a blanket, draping it over his shoulders. "You should sit down," she said gently. "You've done enough for one day." Tom nodded, sitting on the muddy ground, watching as passengers were loaded onto ambulances. He felt a strange detachment, as if he were observing the world from outside himself. The adrenaline had faded, leaving only exhaustion and reflection. Questions buzzed in his mind. How would the world respond? How would people see him? Would they understand that he hadn't acted out of bravado but out of necessity? Would they see the humanity in the act, or simply the spectacle? The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the battered field. The storm clouds had dispersed, leaving only the eerie calm of aftermath. Birds began to stir, circling overhead, unaware of the human drama below. The farm fields beyond the emergency vehicles stretched endlessly, quiet and peaceful, a stark contrast to the chaos that had just unfolded. Tom closed his eyes briefly, letting the sounds of the field, the distant sirens, the murmurs of passengers, the low hum of helicopters wash over him. He realized something fundamental. Survival wasn't just about the act itself, but about the people, the connections, the fragility of life. Every life aboard that plane had mattered. Every person's fear, every scream, every prayer had been real. And somehow, impossibly, he had guided them all through it. A young boy approached him, holding a small drawing of a plane. You saved us," the boy said quietly, eyes wide. "I drew this for you." Tom took the paper, hands still trembling, and looked at the crude drawing of a plane flying above a green field. He smiled faintly, a rare, exhausted smile. "Thank you," he said softly. "I'm glad you're safe." As night fell, the field was transformed into a scene of controlled chaos. Emergency lights flashed, news crews broadcast live, and helicopters continued to circle overhead. Tom remained seated, the weight of what had happened pressing down on him. He had faced the impossible and he had prevailed. But the emotional toll, the enormity of it, was only beginning to sink in. The world would remember this day. Headlines would proclaim a miracle. Experts would debate the mechanics, the physics, the improbability. But Tom Hensley knew the truth. It wasn't luck. It wasn't skill alone. It was courage, instinct, a refusal to surrender to fear. And in the quiet moments, as the sun set over the fields, he understood that heroes didn't choose to be heroes. They simply did what had to be done. And sometimes, against impossible odds, that was enough to change the course of hundreds of lives forever. Weeks had passed since Flight 382's impossible landing, but the world still hadn't stopped talking about it. News footage replayed over and over, metal groaning, sparks flying, passengers screaming, and then, almost impossibly, the plane skidding to a stop on the muddy farmland. Headlines splashed across screens. Farmer saves hundreds in miraculous landing, ordinary man, extraordinary courage. Flight 382, a miracle in the sky. Social media was ablaze, a wildfire of disbelief, awe, and gratitude. Tom Hensley sat quietly in his small farmhouse kitchen, the radio humming softly in the background. Outside, the sun dipped behind rows of corn, casting long golden shadows across the fields he had plowed since boyhood. Everything was as it had always been, still, familiar, quiet, but nothing was the same. He had returned to the life he had always known, yet his world had shifted irreversibly. His hands, calloused from years of farm work, rested on the wooden table, trembling slightly, not from fatigue but from the awareness of what he had done. He had been thrust into a global spotlight, hailed as a hero, a savior. People he had never met wrote letters, sent gifts, offered thanks. Some called him a legend, others called him a miracle worker, and all he could do was sit and feel the weight of it. He hadn't sought glory, he hadn't sought recognition. He had simply acted, guided by instinct, experience, and a refusal to surrender to fear. But now the world wanted him to embody something larger than himself, something almost mythic. And Tom, sitting in his familiar kitchen, wondered if he was up to the task. The farmhouse phone rang, its shrill tone cutting through the quiet. He picked it up, voice hoarse, eyes still tracing the familiar patterns of the worn wooden counter. On the line was a voice he had expected but not quite prepared for, the mayor of his town. "Tom, we need you," the mayor said, excitement and urgency in his voice. "The whole town wants to honor you. A ceremony, a celebration. You've done something no one will ever forget." Tom hesitated. "I don't know about all that. I just did what had to be done." "Exactly," the mayor insisted. "And that's why people need to see you, to hear you, to celebrate what you did. You've changed lives more than you know. This is bigger than one town, Tom. It's bigger than you." He hung up, staring out the window at the fields he had tilled for decades. The wind rustled the cornstalks, a gentle reminder of life continuing, indifferent to fame, indifferent to miracles. And yet the world had changed. People had witnessed something extraordinary, and now, somehow, he was part of that story. Days later, the ceremony unfolded in the town square, a modest gathering compared to the media frenzy, but no less emotional. Families from the flight had flown in, journalists had followed, and neighbors crowded in to see the man who had turned panic into hope. A young mother approached, clutching her child. Tears streamed down her face as she handed Tom a small, hand-painted card. "Thank you for saving us," it read. "You gave us a second chance at life." Tom accepted it quietly, emotions choking him. He had saved lives, yes, but the reality of it, the sheer enormity, was still settling in. This was no longer just about a landing. This was about the ripple effects of courage, the lives forever changed by one decision, one act, one moment of resolve. Later, a local news anchor approached him, microphone in hand. "Tom, people all over the world want to know, how did you stay calm? How did you survive the impossible?" Tom looked down at the dirt under his boots, at the hands that had held tractor levers and plows that had guided machinery through storms and mud. "I don't know if I can explain it," he said slowly. "I just did what I had to do. Sometimes you just act. Sometimes fear is there, but it can't control you. You have to decide. And in that moment, I chose to keep going." The reporter nodded, captivated, but Tom felt only the weight of truth. Courage wasn't heroic because it was recognized. It was heroic because it existed when it mattered most. And in that field, in the cockpit, on Flight 382, courage had been the difference between life and death. The weeks turned into months, and Tom returned to his routines, the fields, the animals, the simple life that had shaped him. Yet every corner of the world seemed aware of him now. People recognized him at the store, journalists requested interviews, and strangers approached, sometimes timidly, sometimes boldly, just to shake the hand of the man who had performed the impossible. He felt conflicted. Part of him longed for anonymity, for the quiet life he had always known. Another part felt an unspoken responsibility to the passengers, to the world, to the story that had unfolded. He had been given a unique perspective on life and death, and he couldn't ignore it. One evening he walked the fields, the sun low, casting long shadows across the corn. The air was thick with the smell of earth and growing crops, a comforting reminder that life continued, regardless of miracles, headlines, or heroism. He thought of the passengers, the young girl clutching her stuffed animal, the grandmother whispering prayers, the teenage boy who had held onto hope through sheer terror. Every face lingered in his mind. Every moment haunted and inspired him. He understood then that the legacy of Flight 382 wasn't the headlines or the ceremonies. It wasn't the fame or the awards. It was the lives saved, the hope rekindled, the understanding that ordinary people could do extraordinary things when confronted with impossible circumstances. Letters arrived from passengers, heartfelt and deeply personal. One wrote, "I look at my child every day and thank you. You didn't just save us from a plane crash, you gave us a future." Another wrote, "I will never forget the fear, but I will also never forget the courage you showed. You made me believe in hope again." Tom kept them in a small wooden box, reading them quietly in the evenings, reflecting on what had transpired. Each letter was a reminder that heroism wasn't about recognition. It was about impact, about the lives touched and the choices made when there seemed to be no choice at all. Months later, the FAA released a detailed report of Flight 382, praising the miracle of the landing. Experts analyzed every decision, every maneuver, every adjustment Tom had made, confirming what the passengers already knew. It had been nothing short of extraordinary. They called it a miraculous convergence of instinct, courage, and resolve. But Tom didn't think about the analysis. He thought about the lives, the families. The fear turned into relief, the chaos turned into calm. Years passed. Flight 382 became part of aviation lore, a case study in impossible survival, in the power of human courage. Tom Hensley returned fully to his farm, tending crops, repairing fences, plowing fields, living the life he had always known. Yet the world never entirely let him go. Invitations arrived, letters poured in, and the story of the farmer who landed a plane against all odds became a legend whispered in awe. And still, he remained quietly himself, a man shaped by storms, by fields, by ordinary life made extraordinary through extraordinary circumstances. He never claimed heroism. He never sought recognition. He simply lived quietly, letting the impact of that single, miraculous act ripple outward into the lives of others. On a warm summer evening, he stood at the edge of the field, the sun sinking low, casting long shadows over rows of corn. He could hear the faint sound of children playing in the distance, families laughing, life continuing. And he realized that heroism, courage, and legacy weren't about fame or glory or applause. They were about survival, about choice, about the impact one life could have on countless others. Tom Hensley smiled faintly, eyes reflecting the fading light. The plane, the passengers, the terror, the miraculous landing, they were all part of him now. But so was the quiet life he loved, the land that had taught him resilience, and the understanding that ordinary people in extraordinary moments could accomplish the impossible. And as he walked back to his farmhouse, the wind rustling through the corn, he knew one thing with certainty. The legacy of Flight 382 was not just a story. It was life itself, a testament to courage, hope, and the power of the human spirit to rise, even in the face of impossible odds. Flight 382 had landed. The world had watched, and an ordinary man had proven that sometimes the extraordinary lies not in training or fame, but in the courage to act when the stakes are unimaginably high.